I'm not going to make the FE7 video. Well, I did record it and, obviously go through, the story and stuff. Read through it again, but it's just, I just don't want to really do it. So ultimately, this video, I guess, will have more of a focus on FE6 and 7 about the, I guess, potential idea that they are alternate timelines in a sense. First, very briefly, of course, Fire Emblem 7, the first game to release out west. That's a pretty big deal. It featured Lyn, a very beloved Fire Emblem character. Lyn mode, forced tutorials, not a huge fan, but whatever. And not a huge fan of the other main lords, Eliwood and Hector. But of course, there's also Nurgle, again, quintessence objectifying the life's prowess and its potential, I guess you could say. And Nurgle, he is a tragic but I guess understandable villain in a sense. But of course, getting to the idea of FE6 and 7 being alternate timelines. So of course, the biggest, I guess, sort of piece of evidence pointing to it immediately is the post-credits scene you get in FE7 with Eliwood and Hector, 15 years into the future. Obviously, you see Roy and Lilina, meeting each other and, having fun, and that's pretty cool. But of course, you get this interesting, ominous music detailing the fact that the King of Bern had just been killed, apparently, presumably recently. But as we see in FE6, Guinevere said that basically Zephiel killed, King Desmond when, she was still a child, essentially, and couldn't really understand what was going on. But apparently, if in this timeline, FE7's timeline, that Desmond was killed 15 years later after they defeated Nurgle and all that stuff, that obviously would seem to be at odds with each other. Of course, the other idea as to why it could be a separate timeline, well, it's sort of a revolving door of reasons. So of course, Mark is a character in FE7, and of course Mark directly influences what happens to Lyn, of course, in this game. Obviously Lyn isn't in FE6, I guess she is sort of, was kind of tacked in there in FE7 in a sense, but of course Lyn, simply due to the presence of Mark, greatly influences her journey in this game. And of course, Lyn decides to travel with Mark to Volgar, and there, of course, that's how Lyn is able to meet Kent and Sane, who tell Lyn of, her grandfather, who is the Marquess of Caelin currently. But of course, Lundgren is trying to kill, Lord Hausen of Caelin, and obviously Lyn, wants to go help him and stuff. And of course, she recruits some friends along the way, stuff like that. And she also meets Nils and Ninian, which is obviously important, but of course, how she meets Ninian, of course, she makes friends with Eliwood. Eliwood, makes acquaintances with Lyn, and, apparently he's really, really stricken by Lyn's eyes, her beauty, something about her, I guess. But either way, of course, they depart, and Lyn defeats Lundgren and resides in Caelin, to help soothe her grandfather and maybe help look over the region. But of course, about a year later, the main story kicks off, and Eliwood and friends, once they realize that Darren of Laos has invaded Caelin, that's obviously when Eliwood and friends, very quickly spring to action, and of course they help her, and afterwards, Lord Hausen is still alive, and Lyn thanks them and decides to join their army to help whatever cause they are trying to fight. Lyn doesn't have a massive impact on the story from here on out, but she does, verbally, spar with Hector, and she does keep the mood light, I guess. But of course, I guess the most interesting thing is the fact that I believe in chapter 25, she follows a Blackfang soldier, and that Blackfang soldier leads them to the location of Sonia, who is, of course, giving Nino and Jafar the mission to assassinate the young Prince Zephiel. And after defending Zephiel, Eliwood and friends go to Queen Helena and tell her that her son was, he had a hit put out on him, and Helena doesn't care. She's mostly just concerned about, finding whatever the key is for for his coronation ceremony. But Eliwood confronts Queen Helene about, using Zephiel as purely a means of gaining the throne, and Helene is a little bit taken aback by it, but ultimately she, blasts some whatever infamousys at Eliwood, and Eliwood and friends, they just leave. They gave up their shot, so to speak, to find out the location of what they were looking for. But of course, after a little bit of time and Murdoch's report, Helene, I guess, suddenly flips a switch or something, and she actually decides to give Eliwood and friends the fire emblem and the location of a legendary weapon, I guess. But of course, that is interesting that Helene, of course, she is now, I guess, no longer, completely mad, and apparently she wants to help rebuild her relationship with Zephiel and Desmond, and that's cool and all, but the point is that all of this supposedly happens in the FE7 timeline, which, Helene, not being mad anymore, or, not being ruled by, her crazy obsession over Zephiel's, succession and all the weird emotions that came from that she, an attempt to establish, a much more a caring mother, a caring mothership, a much more caring, considerate outward personage, hopefully, with Zephiel's mother, not being, completely insane, that would, likely, delay the fact that Desmond probably wouldn't, die as quick in the FE7 timeline. Because of course, if Queen Helene continued to stay mad like this, then she would have, driven Zephiel to insanity, and probably would have caused, Zephiel to murder his father, much quicker. But in FE6, Zephiel presumably murdered his father much sooner. While in FE7, as we see here, obviously that happened 15 years down the line instead. And it's still even vague to the point where, we don't even know exactly if it was Zephiel himself who attempted to kill his father here, at least if you go off of what Hector says. But regardless of that, why would this, supposed, alternate timeline thing between FE6 and FE7 even matter in the first place? Well, maybe it doesn't matter that much. Ultimately, Nurgle, he's the main villain in FE7, he's largely unaccounted for in FE6, and to put it quite simply, of course, he's a dead man walking. He's lost himself a long time ago, even if he is capable of feeling, some level of emotion. Ultimately, there's only so far that a dead man essentially can, there's only so much harm that he can cause. Of course, Nurgle does end up causing real harm in FE7, of course, with Lloyd and Linus, submitting to, obviously their father's will, because that's what they've always done in the Black Fang. But either way, though, of course, they're just kind of, they have to betray their relationships with other people, including Nino, and they're just gonna, continue to battle based on, supposedly their duty, but also, of course, Lloyd or Linus, if one of them, has their brother murdered, I guess they are meant to ride or die with them, in a sense, until the very end. But even still, obviously, there's still just a lot of weird aspects of FE7's story that, don't make a lot of sense. And of course, there's the convoluted way of Nurgle, learning about his story and who he was in the first place. You're obviously given no real clues to that in your first playthrough, but yeah, FE7 is just kind of a confused mess. But there is a potential, greater implication as to, FE6 and 7 being alternate timelines. And of course, this is more along the lines of a conspiracy rather than not. But there is the final cutscene of FE7 where, of course, we see Jean talking to Zephiel. And of course, Jean just tells Zephiel that he's a dragon, just dragon, that's all he says to him. And of course, that's what, Jean said he told Zephiel in FE6, but what's, it's still kind of odd why they would even bother showing this cutscene in the first place. Like, yeah, of course Zephiel, wants to give the world back to the dragons, but Zephiel's eyes, they look possessed in a sense. Of course, there's also a similarity to Nurgle's, eye, being, or at least his right eye being very different from his left eye. There's certainly something of a parallel there, but it goes back to FE6, mainly the fact that, of course, Zephiel says, humans have petty emotions that ultimately create madness, and that's his stated reason as to why he wants to wipe humans out. But, of course, how would a rule by dragons be any different? Roy asks Zephiel that, and Zephiel pretty much completely ignores that question. How would Zephiel know, what dragons are like, how they interact with people, or, how compassionate are they? How would Zephiel even, have that information? How would he even have a grasp for any of that stuff? Well, if you, sort of follow the premise that Zephiel is possessed in some way, maybe by some, some dragon or some other, unseen force, that could partially recontextualize his story, but why, I don't know exactly what it's supposed to mean or anything. It's just kind of something that's a possibility, but something that is, of course, interesting, I guess, is the fact that, of course, there are divine dragons in Alib, obviously, as you well know, but there are no fell dragons or, dark dragons, as you would put it, Medius or, of course, Loptis. But, obviously we know there are some weird, mysterious forces that are at work here, but in Alib, the forces that, ended up creating the ending winter, and, of course, as Roy points out, supposedly some, forces, some beings created, some very intricate traps, designed to protect, the legendary weapons, of course, but ultimately it's all just mysteries and no answers and hearsays and whatnot, and ultimately, as for right now, it all appears to be meaningless. But whether or not Zephiel was possessed or any other number of possibilities, ultimately, it is a tragic tale of what happens, obviously with both Zephiel and Nurgle, but either way, of course, Nurgle, he sought power, simply to, try to find his wife again, and obviously that gave him some very, very ethereal, some very interesting, eclectic, types of feelings, but ultimately, he couldn't find what he was looking for, and ultimately he created something that was, way more pathetic, up until his death, and, it's just kind of more sad than anything. That, of course, he even forgot his children, who are also dragons, and of course dragons as a whole are still, largely, I guess, prejudiced against in Alib, and, Nurgle, being as clever as he was, if he had, kept on to his sanity, maybe he could have come to a proper solution for both humans and dragons in Alib, but that didn't end up happening. And of course, with Zephiel, jealousy, hatred, greed, whatever it is, he grew up in an abusive household, to say the least, and, that can cause you to feel even more trapped. It's one of the easiest ways for anyone to feel trapped, really, if that's the people you grew up with, or, there's no opportunities for you as a child, or, stuff like that, domestic, pretty bad, terrible domestic households are one of the easiest ways to create some true monsters, let's just say that. But even still, whether or not Zephiel was justified in his actions of trying to murder the entire human race or not, or whether, the people of Alib are truly pathetic, or, truly worthy of, some level of scorn, some level of broader scorn, that is, something that, all humans, should get punished for, in a sense. Even if you do believe that, ultimately Zephiel, he was not in his right mind. He lost faith in himself. He also sort of, in a way, lost sight of his goal, just like Nurgle. And ultimately, the tragic fates of both of them ended up leading into an unfortunate set of circumstances. But of course, Idan, provides a ray of hope that potentially humans and dragons can find a way to get along in the future. And I guess that's the biggest point. So, well, that was a mess. But before we go, of course, we will talk about the music. So yeah, and this game's music, FE6. Yeah, it's I do like it quite a bit. Don't really have much more to say than that. It's just, yeah, this music's wow. I mean, of course, the GBA compression, obviously, everyone has to deal with it, with this very, very unique sounding, type of sound font, sound chip, sound, deliberation. But, the fact that, you can take advantage of, the GBA sound chip so much like this and, really, lean into it, for this song specifically, at least, that's quite nice. And of course, this song, it's prideful. It's also, mournful. It's also dignified. It embodies, three different parts of the three different wyvern generals. But ultimately, though, yeah, obviously, there's other, pretty nice songs. Of course, Beneath the New Light, It's a nice cascade of melodies, a nice serenade, if you will. That it's very playful and joyful in its general manner. But of course, also cast theme, very simple melody at first, but it ends up turning into a nice little comedic and slightly sarcastic little tiff of melodies here that is it's supposed to come off sort of as a happy-go-lucky song, sort of, but of course Kath, she is a little bit upbeat, but ultimately, of course, the tragic backstory with her and the very large contrast with Roy and the things that Roy generally knows and understands for being the son of Elliewood and being very noble and dignified, and of course he wants to uphold the law as well. Of course, he hates stealing and stuff, and this the relative dissonant contrast between both Kath and Roy make for an interesting and a very a song that sort of makes you think, I guess, in a sense. But ultimately, regardless of all this stuff, it is very nice. And obviously we can't forget to mention for the commanders, this map theme, highlighting, just how truly tragic the slavery is, the forced work on the Western Isles, and, just the general type of situation in its entirety. But of course, Roy, the fact that, that he has a theme this somber, this relatively early in the game, he doesn't show, much in terms of character progression, in the first 8 chapters, but once this theme starts to finally kick in, you start to get a sense of just what it is you're fighting for. And yeah, this song, it packs a lot of punch and emotion into it. That is very it's very hard to explain, but regardless of everything and everything. Of course, it definitely seems like there was a greater story that they were trying to tell with the Aleve games, but either maybe due to time constraints or ultimately deciding to push some of it off, to later games or whatever the case may be. Ultimately, Aleve, there is missed potential. There is there is some solace in some of the things that happen in the game story, but there's really nothing for it. So either way, we're moving on to Sacred Stones, and yeah, Sacred Stones, it's definitely weirder than the Alib games, but you know, it does tell a story that is at least a little bit more, cohesive. So let's just move on to it.